Yeah, man.
I'm recording. We're not using this, but yeah, that's Wall of Voodoo when I met Stan and did a shoot with Stan Ridgway.
Uh-huh.
Fee Waybill stuff from the Tubes, Billy Bob Thornton's band. I have a
Wow.
Downey Mildew set list,
Whoa.
an Adamant thing, Sparks, some fun stuff.
Nice.
Now, hidden somewhere behind there, and this all happened so quickly I wasn't able to grab it. I'll tell you the story on camera as well, but I have some cool Sonic Youth artifacts from '87, but we can talk about
Really?
that too.
Whoa. Okay.
So let
Curious.
me know if you're good. This is a pleasure and treat for me. This will be fun.
Yeah, man. No, I'm totally good.
All right, cool. Um, great. All right. Then we'll change the view here. Here we go. All right. All right. Yeah, well, good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Um, so yeah, so in '87, I think this was literally maybe possibly my first ever foray into music journalism. I was writing for the school paper. I was a sophomore, 10th grade. I wrote to SST, and someone kind over there sent me a whole packet, and it was right around the time of Sister. So they sent me the record, and they sent me a poster and press kits from Sonic Youth and Opal and Meat Puppets, all that great stuff back then. And it was such a thrill to have all that tangible stuff. And I brought it into the classroom, and I had a really cool teacher that let me do a whole profile on SST, and I featured a review of
Whoa.
Sister and all that. So that was a blast. But yeah,
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, SST in the 80s was, they were really smart the way they kind of would create all this ephemera about the bands, just the myth of that label, being really local to like the Southern California sound and the fact that they were reaching out beyond their own sort of neighborhood, getting bands like us or the Subhumans from Canada or the Dicks from Texas. That was kind of like that was their kind of next move after the neighborhood thing of Black Flag, Minutemen, Saccharine Trust, and you're going to get the Meat Puppets or from Arizona, and it was such a
sure.
vanguard label. And the fact that they took it upon themselves to make all this ephemera, all this literature of just like celebrating the groups, and they would send it to everybody and anybody, even some kid like you, like doing a high school newspaper, and presentation. It's fantastic,
Yeah.
very very independent, very proactive, and just like a true alternative to what was happening in the mainstream.
And this has been well documented, but obviously that worked for you to a certain point, and at some point, you were able to move on to that and do the major label thing, but on your own terms.
Yeah, more or less. I mean, we never really sort of had our eyes on any sort of mainstream prize. When we first got involved with SST, it was such a big deal for us because, like I said, they were the vanguard underground label of the USA at that time, and they weren't really just focused on what was so exciting at the time, which was like all the hardcore bands that were happening, coming, and even the more sort of marginalized hardcore bands such as Black Flag or Dead Kennedys, the Minutemen, bands that we were more associated with, as opposed to the more sort of de rigueur, thrash, skank, fast, slow bands, which I
Yeah,
loved, like Minor Threat and their whole ilk, the DC
sure.
hardcore. But the SST in some ways sort of had this more sort of progressive hardcore idea of just like really stretching out the music to surprising places and seeking out bands that were sort of along for that ride. And we were one of them. And I was soliciting them. I was sending cassettes of the first things we did to them. It was Mike Watt of the Minutemen who heard something and he passed it on to Greg. And Greg and Chuck Dukowski of Black Flag heard it. And they thought it would be a good idea to give me a phone call. I always remember that phone call
Yeah.
in New York City on Eldridge Street, where Kim and I were living at the time,
Hmm.
in this little apartment with the bathtub in the kitchen,
Yeah.
and getting the phone call, and it was Greg Ginn of Black Flag asking if Sonic Youth would want to record for SST, and we were already recording for Gerard Cosley's label Homestead
Hmm.
before he
Hmm.
started Matador with his friends, and
Right.
which was cool. But SST was super cool. I mean, it was like really where we wanted to be. So for that, SST was like there was no further place to go. But by '89, yeah, the idea of maybe our music existing in a major label where we would have that distribution, where we would go into places where a label like SST didn't have the facility to get into. We were curious about that, and we wanted to sell more records. We wanted to have more of a presence, and we knew that they could only take it so far. So we
Yeah.
talked to people. The decision was made by talking to people who came out of college radio. And college radio was so important for bands like us because those were the kids in the universities and the colleges across the country who were playing Sonic Youth and Meat Puppets and Minutemen and Black Black. They were playing that music. They graduate and they get work in the major labels,
Yeah.
in the publicity departments, in the radio departments, and they're the ones who reach out to bands like us and Husker Du, and ask if we want to sort of record at their major label, and we trusted them.
Yeah.
You
Sure.
It wasn't like some old school bigwig at the major label calling us up and going, "We're going to make you big stars." It was like, no, it was these college radio guys like, "I think we can do this together." And so there was Mark Cates, who came out of Boston, who was working at Geffen, who pretty much first contacted us. And we followed him to Geffen Records, and they created DGC just to support a new band like us within
Hmm.
that context.
I remember how exciting that was on the outside to see all that. And that was an exciting time for sure. Yeah.
Was all very surprising. I mean, it was exciting, but everything was exciting. I mean, just getting in a van and crisscrossing the country and playing with like new bands and just sort of meeting people. And I mean, that kind of growing up in that milieu was exciting all the time. Getting involved with a major label, in some ways, it didn't really feel exciting. It felt a little risky. It felt a
Yeah.
little weird. We were somewhat we polarized a lot of people who were into us at the time. Like, why in God's name would we do that? Somebody like Steve Albini, God bless him, and rest in peace, Steve Albini. He was a good friend and a bit of a genius, but he was also like so against that idea of like moving away from this alternative nation that we had created to actually sort of play in this kind of mainstream playground. Like, why? What's the point? And it's like, well, the point is because they are able to get your records into these places that the independent labels were being prohibited from getting into, and radio play as well, and getting on TV, and people could see you on Saturday Night Live or David Letterman or whatever. It's like
Sure.
Records wasn't getting you on David Letterman, but Geffen Records was.
Yeah.
So, there was something about that, which, and it was also being responsible for what you were doing on a major label. We considered ourselves fairly responsible about like what was going on with like the contracts and everything, as opposed to being like blindly ripped off in some like with some old bluesman contract or something like that, which is what the insinuation was with people like Steve. We're just like, yeah, that's what they do. And it's just like, not to us. You
Right.
don't have to be a
Right.
stupid band and have that, let them do that to you. And we were like, we're not a stupid band.
And tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there was ever a time when you had to or wanted to compromise yourself artistically ever. I think you're probably very proud of that, but maybe there's a story I've missed, but I don't think there was ever that.
The first album we did on Geffen Records, we made sure that we had Raymond Pettibone do the cover artwork. And Raymond Pettibone at that time, he wasn't the blue chip artist he was now, but he was basically the guy at SST Records who was doing all the Black Flag covers and Minutemen covers. And he had done all these self-published books of his drawings, all which were really profound and interesting and just really like button pushing and curious. And we loved Raymond's work, but we knew that his work in the mainstream just didn't exist. So we
Mhm.
decided like we want to use Raymond. I just tore a couple of images that he had, a couple of his illustrations out of a couple of his self-published books, and taped them down onto a 12 by 12-inch white disco sleeve and brought it to Geffen. And the art director there looked at it and said, "Hey, it's pretty rough." And I said, "Well, you can clean it up if you want." And then as they were getting the record together, he says, "The Scotch tape actually looks pretty good. In fact, there's one of your hairs is under the Scotch tape." He's like, should we clean that up? I was like, no, leave it in. I mean, it's like real deal. It's like making a fanzine, but it's a record.
There you
And
are. Yeah.
the fact that it's on Geffen, it was kind of, it was a great little bit of a handshake, a bit of a dance between the underground and the mainstream. And that's what we wanted that record to be. And that's what it was, And we recorded that record no differently than any of our previous records, except for we used a better studio. We were able to afford a better studio. And the dream was like, what if our weird music using alternate tuned guitars and cheap guitars that are good for like nothing except for changing the tuning and using implements under the strings and creating songs that way, having fun that way. Well, if that, how would that music sound if it was recorded in the same studio with the same production value as Aerosmith? That one would be amazing. So by the time we did that, which was like Goo and then Dirty, it wasn't so surprising because it was already started happening anyway. So it was really gradual. It wasn't like this shock of like, oh my God, this underground music produced to sound like Aerosmith. That never really came. I was really disappointed that we didn't have that great, you
Right.
know, epiphany. And in some ways, I realized like actually it sounds better recorded on a 4-track in a basement than it
Yeah. Yeah.
does on a 48 track, that you're paying like, out the wazoo for. So
And people responded in kind, so I think it all worked out. But speaking of covers, and that's a good segue to take us forward to the present, and your love of art and artists and artist friends on your new album. You've continued that very cool trend, and it's such a cool looking uh album.
I love this album cover. It's by Jamie Naris, and I knew Jamie as the guitar player in the first rendition of the Contortions, the infamous New York City no wave band
Mhm.
from the '70s. And Jamie had an amazing career and still does as a visual artist and a filmmaker. He made these great films in the '70s, living in New York. Uh, that like one of them was like hanging a huge pendulum out of his window and just swinging it in the alleyway in slow motion. It's a beautiful thing of just like this huge piece of metal like whipping back and forth between these buildings in downtown New York, and it just evoked this sense of movement, and you could smell the city. Everything about it was great. Um, and all his films were really interesting. I loved his art. Most of it's like really colorful, huge brush strokes of paint that he's been showing in galleries and museums. I went to a retrospective of his in the Contemporary Art Museum in Milwaukee a few years ago, and he invited me to come there and play some music in front of one of his films uh, called called Street, which is
Mhm.
him in the back of a van filming out the window when nobody can see him. And he's filming people on the street as they go along their daily lives in New York. And he slows the camera way, 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 way down. So it's like a ballet. People are moving really gently through the street, doing what they do, which is just like going to work, buying a hot dog, lighting a cigarette, looking at this van passing them suspiciously. It's like it's really beautiful 60-minute film. So I just improvised guitar music in front of it. I got really friendly with him because Byron Coley, the music writer, and I had published a oral history of no wave music many years back, and I
Mhm.
interviewed Jamie, and we became fast friends. We knew each other by sight through the streets of New York. And when
Sure.
my band was first starting, he would look at me and I would look at him, and we would, the way New Yorkers are, you kind of don't say anything. You just sort of look at each other sometimes, and you kind of recognize you're kind of from the same tribe, but you have yet to sort of, break bread. It took a few years, and but she's a beautiful person, Jamie,
Yeah.
and so my wife Eva and I saw this piece in of this helmet, which you would at first think of as like a World War I military helmet of sorts, but instead of any sort of emblems of wartime, it's these tuning forks sticking out of it, and turning the helmet into like a thing of sound, an object of sound and beauty
Mhm.
and communication. This recapturing of this image. I loved it, and so that was the cover. That was the choice. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, Jamie Naris. I was really happy to have a New York artist from that world of no wave be the cover art for this record,
Love it.
Flow Critical Lucidity, for sure.
going into this record, you were coming off a solo record that was perhaps one of your best acclaimed, reviewed. You got a lot of love for your last album. Obviously, it was so well done. What were your goals, dreams, hopes going into this one? How did you approach this new album?
Well, it's interesting because it was coming out of the pandemic, and a lot of that year plus, I was really heads down writing a memoir called Sonic Life about growing up and
Sure.
the idea of devoting yourself to the vocation of whatever discipline you choose in art, and of course mine was music. And so I wrote this memoir, and that's what I did. And in some ways, I stepped away from the guitar and doing any kind of composition for a lot of that year. And after things started settling down and the book was pretty much done, I spent like most of 2021 editing it with my editor because it was 800 pages and they only wanted 300, settled on 400. And so I went to Eva and I went to an artist residency in Switzerland that's right on Lake Geneva, which sounds really exquisite, and it was, and they're friends of mine who run this thing,
Mhm.
and I've worked with them before. They put gigs on for my band in Switzerland, and so we went there and locked ourselves away, and there's other people like some sound artists and some sculptors and some painters, et cetera, who were there also locked away in their little rooms doing work. And you could do whatever you want in these Europe has this thing where they actually support the arts. Some countries don't do that.
Right.
Europe does. They actually support the arts. In some countries they actually pay you to go to school to learn art. It's like it's a pretty good idea, I think.
Mhm.
And at least for the psychological welfare of your society, it's a great thing to do, And I highly recommend it to anybody who's running for office these days. And so I wrote the record there. It was just like kind of like the magnetism of the environment of that Lake Geneva and the Alps around it, the mountains. And I was really sort of already informed by gleaning inspiration from nature through the last 7 years or so of spending the summers teaching at Naropa University at a summer writing workshop there. That's called the Jack Kerouac School of
Mhm.
Disembodied Poetics. And the director is Anne Waldman, the poet, and it was founded by her and Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah.
It's this great faculty there every year, and historically, like William Burroughs taught there, and Gregory Corso taught there, Laurie Anderson. It's this amazing school, and so I really love going there. And again, that's in Boulder, Colorado, and the reason it's in Boulder is because the Buddhist scholar who started the school, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, chose that area because it was surrounded by the mountains in Boulder, Colorado, and he knew that that's where this energy was, this mountain energy, this magnetic energy that kind of was all about spiritual and intellectual kind of heightening. And so I kind of, it's really all it's a little sort of esoteric to think about, but I I actually really did feel like that energy was very palpable, and I
Mhm.
felt it there, and I felt it in Switzerland, and that's what informed this record. And a lot of it was like just musing about the dignity of nature and sort of like how we need to really get back into some kind of relationship of respect, and because nature's getting a little angry
Mhm.
right now, because we keep toxifying the air and the land and the oceans. Not that the record is this concept record about like climate change, but
Right. Right.
it is flowing, quote unquote, through the record's lyrics, and the music is informed by that as well. So it's a bit of an airy uh, record, more so than the other albums that are a little more maybe compacted with this kind of like compositional rigor. This record breathes a little bit.
Yeah. Beautifully so. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, we just did it. You just do it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, to me, it's like talking about a record is like, it's kind of like you're talking about going to work in a way. So there's something
Right.
very banal about it. It's like, that's just kind of what I've chose to do in my life is make music, and use it in exchange for some kind of revenue. You got to make some coins somehow,
Of
and so
course, of course.
so there's that aspect to it. You are working. Mike Watt always used to talk about being in the Minutemen as his work. Patti Smith always talks about going to the job as
Yeah.
opposed to the, and this language.
I
Mike
was going
Watt
to
called
mention that Watt still lives by that, as you know, of course, and that's
it. He
yeah,
calls his bass the broom. Yeah, Watts push the broom.
yeah.
Like, and that's how he thinks about it. Which
With
I
with love, it's great. Yeah.
or the MC5.
Coincidentally,
The MC5 used to talk about it like going out in the field with a machine gun, and fighting the good fight, fighting
sure.
for justice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because I listened to this record yesterday for the first time, all the way through, and coincidentally, I was thinking about Gary Snyder, who's one of the last of those guys still around, and I believe he's still up in the mountains somewhere, kind of along those lines, still appreciating and writing about, I believe, at least to a small extent, and talking about nature and exactly some of the same themes.
Yeah. Yeah, I never met Gary Snyder. I've actually crossed paths with a lot of the greats of beat literature, and Gary Snyder is somebody I've never got to meet. I've crossed paths with Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg and Burroughs and Ann Waldman and
I
Joanne
bet.
Craig. Gary
Yeah.
Snyder, I would love to sort of talk to Gary Snyder. I have a feeling his longevity is just because his DNA is responding to the DNA of nature because he has such respect for it, you know,
Hmm.
and he pontificates about it and he writes about it as this real sentient aspect of our lives. You can't, I love cities. I'm all about concrete and noise,
Yeah.
but the city is basically just us recreating the jungle anyway. So I mean, it's like I think Gary Snyder is a brilliant uh, hero of American letters and thought, and yeah.
Yeah. Long may he.
Why did you bring Gary Snyder up? Because
No, because you mentioned
oh
Ginsburg
yeah, 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 yeah.
and the mountains and Boulder and all that
Oh, yeah.
and nature. So I was thinking that was just coincidentally I was thinking about Gary Snyder yesterday at the same time because I forgot what led me to
Yeah.
that yesterday because I go back to him a lot and I found that very interesting. Yeah,
Yeah, he's super inspiring. He's
yeah,
super inspiring.
yeah. Looking at the album covers behind you, I want you to talk about your. I believe some of these. You're one of a lot of the collaborators on this record, and you love having great people collaborate with you. You're always an artist that loves to collaborate with others, and also your label and support and kind of mentorship of some really new, young, cool artists. That's a big part of what you do and what's important to you, obviously.
I've always had a record label since I mean the mid '80s, and since I could afford to actually like buy a cassette and like sit down with Lydia Lunch and Michael Jarrah and have them read something into it, and then the cassette recorder and I put out a spoken word cassette by the two of them. It was a split cassette. First thing I put out, it was called Hard Rock by Lydia Lunch and Michael Jarrah, and they both read these pieces they wrote. Um, I I really, I mean, I was just to me it was all about like community. I mean, to me, punk rock it was a communitarian ideal. And my favorite records were the compilation albums, where it was like regional compilation albums, where it was like all these people kind of in the same neighborhood, sharing these ideas of sound and vocabulary. And
Hmm.
I I wanted to be part of these. I love the fact that there were micro communities. I wasn't really interested in being part of the big picture. I wanted to be part of these like smaller gangs in a way. I thought that was kind of more hip and more cool. I don't know why. I mean, maybe I felt like less, you know, just sort of less typical. I like the idea of being radical and being, on the margins of culture, being in the counterculture. I thought it was, there's something definitely more sexier about it or something, as a young
Yeah.
person. That's where I'd rather be. I didn't even like want to like um, it's not like I wanted to like collect records by I wanted to be the record. I wanted to make the records. I wanted to actually be a record. I wanted to physically be manifest as a record. I Yeah, so I got really into all the different scenes that were happening in underground music since I could even figure out what that was,
Yeah,
like first seeing a picture when I was a little kid in the early 70s of like Iggy Pop spray painted silver standing on the hands of the audience, and pointing at the sky. I was like, who is that? And like, what does that sound like? I didn't care about the Allman Brothers sitting, like, with their hippie hair and like, and their flight cases on the back of the Allman Brothers album, even though I like that stuff, but
sure.
it's just like, I want to know what that sounds like. And you couldn't hear it because it wasn't on the radio. There was no internet. You had to go to the record store and find it, and the record store didn't have it. And so you would just be like, what is that? And what does it sound like? And why is this guy Lester Bangs writing about it, like with all this energy? And so I kind of really started getting to digging and finding these documents of people like Iggy or Captain Beefheart, and and as soon as Patti Smith made a 7-inch, because reading her record reviews, and all of a sudden she made a record, and it was like, wow, what is this record reviewer? What does this rock critic music writer sound like making music? I thought that was such an audacious move, like this woman making a record after like writing this really cryptic and wonderful, beautiful, celebratory, the prosaic work about music, other musicians. And so sending away for her record as soon as I heard about it,
Hmm.
75, 76 or whatever. And so I was just really on it. I don't know. I just like, to me, everything about that ephemera and continues to astound me, just holding a record, smelling it, looking at it. I mean, listening to it at this point, I feel like I've decoded enough of like music, music that I don't really have to listen to it so much.
Yeah,
I really just like looking at it and just like, knowing that that it's there against the wall and like looking
sure.
and just, I've, it's like, you can do things with it. You can roll joints on it. It's like, it's all purpose. Um,
That's why
so no.
I still buy cassettes, and I'm gonna buy yours. And I don't even know how many of these I'm gonna pop in, but I still buy new ones, because I love holding them too,
I gotta
I
say,
still love smelling them. They don't smell the way they used to, but
yeah, yeah, of course. I gotta say, it was that fat ferrous oxide smell. Yeah, you can't beat it. I When I was a teenager, I actually worked at this place called Columbia Magnetics in Danbury, Connecticut, sweeping the floor at like 2 in the morning. And it was this huge factory that had massive spools of brown magnetic tape, and that was the tape that they would strip down and use for cassettes and
wow.
8 tracks and whatever. And I was like working in this place where that so that smell to me is like really heavy. It's a really
Yeah,
profound smell for me.
yeah.
That the cassette of this album, this new album, sounds better than the other formats, the CD and or the vinyl, which sound okay.
I'm buying one today.
I played all three and I was like, damn, the cassette actually sounds better. It's that non-biased. If you have a decent cassette player, which you should have, they're really cheap. Any thrift store has them. Everybody's traded them in. So you get these like $3,000 like Nakamichi cassette players for like $50, $20 if
Yeah,
you're lucky.
yeah,
You can bring them home and like line them into your stereo system and like, yeah, that's the sound.
yeah. So cool. Yeah, I have a beautiful one, just a Denon one from 30 years ago, sitting out in my living room that I need to plug in. But I just love looking at it, but it's there,
Yeah,
you know. uh, and lastly, you mentioned artists like Patti Smith and Iggy and stuff like that. For you to have reached on many levels that same iconic status, how much of that do you think about, care about, appreciate?
I feel, I'm at 66 this year, and I still feel like I'm in apprenticeship in a way. I don't feel like I've reached some kind of goal that I can rest on at all. I think Sonic Youth did a great amount of work, and when that band ended, I felt like it ended on a really solid last album, a really solid last note, and that there wasn't anything really hanging or unfinished with what Sonic Youth could accomplish. Even at the time when we were sort of like ending, I was thinking about doing more solo work outside of the band because that's just where I was at that time in getting into my late 50s. And so now I feel like I'm just I I I feel with this record I really feel like it's just the first record again. I mean, I don't feel like I'm repeating anything, even though I like artists who repeat. I like it. I like to identify an artist. When I go see somebody, I want to hear what I know them to sound like. As
Mhm.
opposed to doing something completely like outside of their what you know. I'm okay with that. I like genres of music that, are dependable. Like when they say all reggae music sounds the same. It's like, that's why I like it. I like
Mhm.
all these variations on this theme. I like hardcore because it's like everybody's kind of trading off on this one idea of like, what a hardcore song is. And so I like genres of music that sort of stick to like one kind of vocabulary. And so I feel that that's also the same with musicians. They have a certain sound. I mean, Paul Westerberg of the Replacements. I always found him really interesting because I kept hearing this thing that he would do in every song he wrote that was kind of the same thing, but I loved it. And it's like if he didn't have that little nugget of Paul Westerberg brilliance in that song, I wasn't that interested in it. So it's just like only he can do it. Only like it's like only the Ramones could play the bar chord like a Ramones can. Like everybody can play a Ramones song, but you can't play it like the Ramones. Everybody can play a Stooges song, but you'll never play it like the Stooges. I sat across from Ron Ashton learning Stooges songs with him, and
Mhm.
he had such an innate personalized swing. It was all about swing. It wasn't this like downstroking kind of like, bombastic, like, chug-a-lug. It was a jazz, just deep soil swing. His
Mhm.
brother Scott, the drummer, yeah, he wasn't like pounding away at the drums. He was like kicked back like he was on the back of a Harley, like, just those guys had class. Those guys had
That's
style.
why Watt is fitting
Yeah.
to that mold as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just like to me, that's what makes all of this so just so magical is that there's distinct magic with each and everyone who's doing it. Sometimes not. You know, there's a lot of not so magical stuff. But if everything was special, it would be overwhelming. You
True. Well,
need some dynamics out there. But
yeah.
yeah.
Well, I listen, you're special and this album's special and I really appreciate the time and congrats on this. It's really, really well done and nice to have new Thurston Moore out in the world. It's a kick.
I appreciate it, Emma. Thank you so much.
Yeah, real pleasure talking to you. Good luck with this. Congrats.
Okay. Be
See,
well.
see you down the road. Yep.
Okay. Cheers, man.
Bye bye.